Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift into one of the quietest mysteries of human life. The strange way that certain words, spoken aloud at certain moments, refuse to disappear. Most of what we say passes without record. The conversations of a single afternoon, the murmured greetings between neighbors, the apologies and reassurances and small jokes that fill an ordinary day, these vanish almost as soon as they are spoken. They are not lost in any sad sense. They simply do their work, and then they let go. That is the natural fate of language, to be useful for a moment, and then to fade gently into the air that carried it. And yet, every so often, a voice finds a moment, and the words it speaks settle into the world and stay. They are repeated by strangers who never knew the speaker. They are written into books, carved into stone, taught to children long after the room they were spoken in has been emptied and forgotten. The chairs are gone, the lamps are gone, the listeners are gone, and still the words remain. Tonight, we will visit 5 such moments. Not battlefields exactly, though one will be a battlefield. Not laboratories, though science will join us before the night is done. We will visit rooms, podiums, and open air. Places where someone stood up or simply sat down and chose to speak, and the world leaned in to listen. It is tempting to think these speeches survived because they were grand or thunderous. Most of them were not. Some lasted only 2 minutes. One was a single sentence delivered by a man too exhausted to stand. Another was offered quietly by a stranger in a cardigan in a small committee room to a senator who had not expected to be moved that afternoon. What they share is something subtler than power. They arrived at the right silence. They knew when to begin, and more rarely, they knew when to stop. They did not try to fill every corner of the room with words. They trusted the space around them, and the space remembered them. Tonight is not a study of rhetoric. There will be no rules of oratory, no diagrams of persuasion. We are here only to listen gently to the reasons certain voices still reach us across years and continents and centuries. To consider what it costs to speak honestly and what is sometimes gained by saying less than expected. So let your shoulders soften. Let the day's voices, the meetings and messages and small frictions settle behind you like dust returning to the floor of a quiet room. The speeches we will visit tonight have already been delivered. Their work is long done. We are only guests now, listening from a great distance in the soft glow of our own evening. If these journeys help you rest, you can follow SleepWise and share it with someone who might enjoy falling asleep while learning something new. Now, with the night around us and the world growing still, let us begin. Before we step into our first moment, it is worth pausing on something that often goes unmentioned. For most of human history, a speech could only travel as far as a single voice could carry it. There were no recordings, no microphones, no cables stretching the sound of one mouth across a continent. If you missed the moment, you missed it. The words drifted into the sky and were gone. This is a strange thought to hold because it means that almost every great speech in human memory survives only because someone, somewhere, wrote it down. Sometimes a scribe recorded it as it was being delivered. More often, it was reconstructed afterward from the imperfect memories of those who had been present, sometimes decades later, sometimes by someone who had not even been there at all. That fragility is part of the story. The words we are about to visit tonight have been carried to us through a long chain of human attention. Some are reliable in nearly every syllable, some are slightly different from what was actually said in the air. The Roman historians who recorded ancient speeches often filled in plausible language where memory failed. The biographers who preserved early American oratory sometimes shaped a sentence until it shone a little brighter than the original moment. This is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the nature of the human voice, passing through human hands on its way to becoming history. What we remember of a speech is rarely an exact transcript. It is something gentler and stranger. It is what stayed. For the speeches we will visit tonight, this matters in different ways. 2 were captured on film and survive in their exact spoken form, with all their pauses and hesitations. 1 was written down faithfully by witnesses on the day it was delivered. Another survives partly through translators and the careful memory of those who heard it. And one of the most famous, our first, exists in several slightly different versions because the speaker himself revised it in the days that followed. So tonight, let us listen the way one listens to a story passed down in a family, with patience, with affection, and a willingness to forgive the small distances between what was said and what was kept. Our first stop is a small town in Pennsylvania on a cool afternoon in November of 1863. The air smells of fallen leaves and turned earth. A new cemetery has just been finished, the grass still thin, the markers freshly placed, the rows stretching farther than the eye can comfortably follow. A great crowd has gathered on the hillside above. The headline speaker is one of the most celebrated orators in America. And almost as an afterthought, a tall, tired president has been invited to offer a few appropriate remarks. He has accepted, and the country has no idea what is about to happen. To understand what happened that afternoon, we have to step back 4 months into the summer of 1863, when the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, became the site of the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. For 3 days in early July, 2 great armies met in the fields and orchards just outside the town. By the time the fighting ended, more than 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, or were missing. The number is difficult to absorb. It was as though every man in a small city had been struck down in the space of 72 hours. Many bodies lay where they had fallen, scattered across miles of farmland, in barns beside stone walls, near streams that ran red for days afterward. Gettysburg itself, A town of fewer than 3,000 residents was overwhelmed. Houses became hospitals. Churches became hospitals. Schools became hospitals. The smell of the dead settled into the streets and would not leave. Neighbors who had recently been farming and walking to market found themselves attending to wounded strangers from places they had only read about. Burial in the days after the battle was hurried and imperfect. Some men were laid to rest where they fell with little more than a shallow covering of earth. By August, it was clear that something more dignified had to be done. A young attorney named David Wills was placed in charge of organizing it. He bought the land, arranged for the careful reburial of the dead, and planned a public dedication ceremony for November. For such a solemn occasion, the most important task was choosing the speaker. Wills wanted the finest orator in America. That choice in 1863 was not a difficult one. It was Edward Everett. Everett is a name that has faded almost entirely from memory now. But in his time, he was the country's most celebrated public voice. A former senator, governor, and president of Harvard, he had spoken at the unveiling of monuments and the funerals of national heroes. His speeches lasted hours and were considered masterpieces of classical eloquence. To invite Everett was to honor the dead with the very best America could offer. Almost as an afterthought, several weeks later, Wills also sent a letter to the President of the United States, inviting him to attend and to offer, in his careful phrasing, a few appropriate remarks. Lincoln was not the headliner. He was the courteous postscript. He accepted. In the days before the ceremony, Lincoln worked on what he would say. He had no team of speechwriters. The few words he was preparing were his own, drawn from years of brooding over the meaning of the war and the country fighting it. The night before the dedication, he arrived in Gettysburg by train. The town was full. Lincoln stayed at the home of David Wills in a small upstairs room and made his final adjustments by lamplight. Outside, the November air was cold. The graves were waiting. The morning of November 19th dawned cool and overcast, though the sun broke through at intervals as the crowd gathered. Perhaps 15,000 people came to the hillside above the new cemetery. Many had traveled by train and wagon. Some were the families of men buried in the fresh ground below. Some were officials and military officers in dress uniform. Most were ordinary citizens who had come to witness an occasion they sensed was important, though none yet knew how important it would become. A military procession opened the ceremony. There were prayers and hymns. A band played a slow, mournful piece. Then Edward Everett rose to deliver the main address. He spoke from memory, without notes, for over 2 hours. His oration was a sweeping survey of the battle and the war. He compared Gettysburg to the great battles of antiquity, wove in classical references, and honored the men buried below. It was the kind of speech people had paid to hear in lecture halls. The crowd listened, sometimes restlessly, as the long sentences rolled forward. The afternoon wore on. The wind shifted. People shuffled their feet against the cold. When Everett finally finished, there was applause, music, and a brief pause. Then Lincoln stood up. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit that seemed slightly too short for his long arms and legs. He held a single page of notes. He adjusted his spectacles. He began to speak in the high, reedy voice that surprised many people the first time they heard it. They expected something deeper from a man who looked the way he did. What followed lasted roughly 2 minutes. It was about 270 words. He did not mention Gettysburg by name. He did not mention the Union or the Confederacy. He did not list the generals, name the regiments, or recount the battle. He went somewhere else entirely. He went back to the founding of the country 87 years earlier and asked what the country had been founded on. He named the proposition that all men are created equal and asked, without quite asking it directly, whether a nation built on such a proposition could survive a war this terrible. He suggested that the dead in the ground below had given the living an unfinished work, that they had not died for a battle or a war, but for an idea about what a country could be. And then he sat down. Some in the audience were not sure he had finished. The applause came late and was scattered. A photographer setting up his camera missed the entire address, still adjusting his lens when Lincoln returned to his seat. There is no clear photograph of the moment. Everett, the great orator, had filled the air for 2 hours. Lincoln had taken less time to speak than it takes to read his words aloud now. He himself reportedly leaned over to a friend afterward and remarked that the speech had not gone well. He was, in this moment, almost completely wrong. In the days that followed, the response was uncertain. Some newspapers praised Lincoln's brief remarks. Others dismissed them. A paper in Chicago called the speech silly, flat, and dishwatery. Even some of Lincoln's allies thought he had missed an opportunity, that he had given too little where so much had been expected. But there were others, more attentive listeners, who understood almost at once that something unusual had happened. Edward Everett, of all people, may have been the first. The next morning, he sat down and wrote a letter to the president. He told Lincoln that he wished he could flatter himself that he had come as close to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as Lincoln had come in 2 minutes. It is one of the gracious moments in American history. The great orator, quietly bowing to the strange power of the spare president he had nearly upstaged. Over the months and years that followed, the address grew quietly larger. Newspapers reprinted it. School children memorized it. By the time of Lincoln's assassination 18 months later, the speech had begun to take on the weight it still carries. By the next century, it was carved in stone at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, where visitors still paused to read it in silence. What had Lincoln understood that Everett, with all his eloquence, had not? Perhaps simply this. He had understood that the cemetery itself was already speaking. The graves, the families, the cost stretched across the hillside in long, careful rows, the silence over the freshly turned earth, All had their own voice. A long speech would have competed with that voice. A short speech could let it through. Lincoln did not try to fill every space. He trusted the dead to do part of the speaking. He gave the day a few quiet sentences, lifted what those sentences pointed toward, and stepped back. The ceremony then completed itself in the listener and in the time that followed. There is a lesson in this for anyone who has ever wished to say something important. The most powerful thing a voice can sometimes do is stop. To say less than the moment seems to demand. To leave room for the listener to feel, to think, to remember. This idea will return more than once tonight. We will meet a man on a cold mountain who said a single sentence and ended an entire chapter of his people's history. We will meet another in a courtroom who spoke for hours and then fell silent for 27 years. We will meet a quiet man in a cardigan whose 6 minutes of plain speaking changed the mind of a senator who had decided not to be moved. But before we leave Gettysburg, let one image remain. The November afternoon, the graves still fresh. A tall man on a wooden platform speaking in his high, quiet voice for 2 short minutes, and then sitting down into the long silence that followed. The silence the world has been listening to ever since. Lincoln had spoken over the dead and asked what their sacrifice could mean. 14 years later, on the other side of a wide and changing country, another leader would speak not over the dead, but over the living, over exhausted, freezing families who had walked nearly 1,200 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. He would speak in only a few brief sentences, and like Lincoln, he would understand that to say less sometimes is to say more than any longer speech could. The speech we're about to visit was not delivered in a cemetery. It was delivered in a snow-covered meadow in northern Montana, beneath a low gray sky, with the breath of horses and tired soldiers visible in the cold air. It was not given by a head of state in a tall hat. It was given by a chief whose people had been pushed to the edge of their endurance, almost to the edge of an international border, and whose very presence in that meadow was the result of months of running. The year was 1877. The man's name, in English, was Chief Joseph. In his own language he was called Hinma tu ya lat kekt, which is often translated as thunder rolling down the mountain. To understand the weight of his words, we have to walk back into the world he came from, a world of clear rivers and deep forests, of salmon runs that filled the streams in summer and horses that grazed in the high meadows, a world that, only a generation earlier, had seemed to most of its people steady, ancient, and unchanging. So let Gettysburg drift gently into memory. The November afternoon, the rows of graves, the tall man on the platform speaking in his high, quiet voice, "We are going west, and we are going back. Back to the Pacific Northwest of the early 19th century, into a long green valley between 2 mountain ranges, into the wide rolling country beyond it, into a way of life that had been carefully fitted to its land for many hundreds of years. This is the world of the Nez Perce. It begins, as so many quiet stories do, in a place its people loved. There is a tenderness to such stories and a sadness too, because we already know how they end. We know that the valleys will not stay safe. We know that the long horse herds will be scattered, the lodges burned, the rivers crossed in flight. We know that the chief, who will eventually speak to us in the snow, has not yet learned how to be that chief. He is still, at the start of our story, simply a young man growing up in a quiet place that taught him how to listen and how to choose his words with care. For now, let the meadow in Montana wait. Let the soldiers and the snow and the long line of exhausted horses stand still in the future. We have a green valley to visit first, and a way of life to walk gently through before the running begins. The Nez Perce, who called themselves Nimipu, meaning simply the people, lived in the high plateau country where Idaho, Oregon, and Washington meet. Their traditional homeland stretched across roughly 17 million acres of mountain valleys, river canyons, and rolling grasslands. It was a varied and abundant country. 5 great rivers ran through it, including the Snake, the Salmon, and the Clearwater. Salmon arrived each year in numbers difficult for a modern person to imagine, filling the streams with their bright bodies. Camas bulbs grew in the meadows. Elk moved through the forests in their seasons. The Nez Perce way of life was shaped by these rhythms. Families followed the salmon to their spawning grounds in spring and summer. They harvested camas roots in the high meadows in midsummer. In autumn, they hunted in the mountains. In winter, they drew together in sheltered valleys, in long lodges warmed by careful fires, telling the stories that had been told there for as long as anyone could remember. In the early 18th century, horses came into their world from the south, and the Nez Perce became some of the finest horse breeders on the continent. They developed the spotted breed, now known as the Appaloosa. With horses, their range widened. They crossed the Bitterroot Mountains to hunt buffalo on the plains. But always they returned to their valleys. When Lewis and Clark stumbled out of the mountains in 1805, exhausted and starving, it was the Nez Perce who fed them. The expedition would not have survived without that kindness. Almost every American account of the early Pacific Northwest passes through Nez Perce hospitality. For decades after, the relationship between the Nez Perce and the United States remained, if not equal, at least peaceful. A treaty in 1855 recognized Nez Perce land, including the Wallowa Valley in northeastern Oregon, where Joseph's band lived. The Wallowa was a place of extraordinary beauty. Lakes lay among high mountains. Wide grasslands rolled down to the river. To Joseph's family, it was home, beyond questioning. Then, as so often in American history, gold was found. In 1860, prospectors discovered gold on Nez Perce land. Settlers poured in. The promises of the 1855 treaty became inconvenient. A new treaty was negotiated in 1863, which ceded almost 90% of the original Nez Perce homeland, including the Wallowa Valley. Joseph's father refused to sign it. He never accepted that the document had any standing over his people. The federal government called it a treaty anyway, and acted as though it bound everyone. For the next 14 years, two understandings of the law moved in parallel, like two rivers that did not meet. The government held that the Wallowa Nez Perce were trespassers on their own land. The Wallowa Nez Perce held that they had never agreed to leave it. Then, in 1877, the patience of the United States Army finally ran out. Joseph was not by nature a war leader. He had spent years trying to negotiate. He understood, perhaps more clearly than the men sent to negotiate with him, what would happen if his people were pushed into open conflict with the United States Army. He counseled patience. He spoke softly in council and listened more than he spoke. In the spring of 1877, an Army general named Oliver Howard arrived in the region with orders to remove the Wallowa band to a reservation in Idaho. Howard gave them 30 days. Joseph asked for more time. The cattle were scattered across the high country. The rivers were swollen with snowmelt. Crossing them with women, children, and herds would mean losses no people could absorb. Howard refused. The Nez Perce began their reluctant move, and then, almost at the last moment, a few young men, grieving losses and angered by the long humiliation, struck back at white settlers along the Salmon River. The leaders had not approved it, but once it began, there could be no return. Joseph and the other chiefs gathered their bands and fled. What followed was extraordinary. Roughly 750 Nez Perce, including women, children, and the elderly, set out across the mountains, hoping to reach safety somewhere the army could not follow. Only about 250 of them were warriors. The rest were simply families, trying to live. For more than 3 months, they ran. They crossed the Bitterroot Mountains. They moved through the Big Hole Valley in Montana, where they were attacked at dawn by soldiers and lost dozens of women and children before the warriors could organize a defense. They crossed the Yellowstone region just as it was becoming the world's first national park, frightening tourists who had never imagined being inside a war. They climbed through high passes and narrow trails, with soldiers pursuing from several directions at once. They covered roughly 1,200 miles. They fought a series of battles and skirmishes, often outnumbered, often without supplies, often with the wounded slowing their pace. And again, they outmaneuvered the soldiers sent to catch them. Newspapers across the country followed the chase. Some readers cheered for the army. Others found themselves quietly admiring the small, exhausted force trying so hard to reach freedom. Joseph was not the chief military strategist. That credit belongs largely to other Nez Perce leaders, including his brother Olocott and the war chiefs Looking Glass and Tuhul-Hul-Zot. But Joseph carried a different weight. He held the families together. He kept the non-combatants moving. He spoke to them in the cold mornings and tended the wounded. By late September, they were within 40 miles of Canada. The border was almost in sight. They stopped to rest in a meadow at the foot of the Bear Paw Mountains, believing they had nearly outrun the war. They had not. On the morning of September 30th, while the families were still in camp, a fresh column of soldiers under Colonel Nelson Miles attacked from the south. The battle that followed was bitter and exhausting. The Nez Perce fought from rifle pits dug into the cold ground. Snow began to fall. Some of the people in the chaos slipped away through the lines and made it across the border into Canada. Others, including most of the warriors who had led the long flight, were killed. For 5 days, the siege continued. The wind grew colder. Food ran out. The wounded suffered without medicine. Joseph's brother Ollicott was dead. So were Looking Glass and Tuhul-Hul-Zote, the chiefs who had organized the flight, who had outwitted the army across 1,000 miles of mountains, were now silent in the snow. On October 5th, 1877, Joseph rode out under a gray sky to meet General Howard and Colonel Miles. He carried his rifle across his saddle. The wind moved across the open meadow. The soldiers and his own people watched. He dismounted, handed over the rifle, and began to speak. The words he spoke that day were translated and written down by a young Army officer named Charles Erskine Scott Wood. The version that has come down to us is brief, simple, and almost unbearably tired. He spoke of the chiefs who were dead. He spoke of the children freezing in the hills, of those who had run to the mountains and had no blankets, no food. He said his heart was sick and sad. And he ended with the line that has carried his voice into history. From where the sun now stands, he said, I will fight no more forever. It is worth pausing on that sentence. It is not, on its surface, dramatic. It contains no metaphor, no flourish, but it does something rare. It marks an ending with absolute precision. He did not say, I am defeated. He did not say, I surrender. He said something quieter and stranger. From where the sun now stands, from this exact moment, on this exact day, in this exact light, I will fight no more. And then the word that gives the sentence its weight, forever. It is the speech of a man who knows that a chapter is ending and who refuses to allow the ending to be vague. He chooses the moment himself. He places it in time. He gives it a precise hinge upon which the rest of his life and his people's life will turn. In doing so, he turns a defeat into something else, not a triumph, not a comfort, but an act of dignity, the power to name the ending even when one has lost the power to prevent it. The translation may have polished his actual words slightly. The exact phrasing may not be what he said in his own language, but the shape of the moment, the weight of the chosen finality, that is real. It cannot be edited out. He ended with those words and stepped back into silence. The promises made on that meadow were not kept. Joseph and his people had been told that they would be sent back to the Idaho reservation, where some of their relatives lived and where they could begin to rebuild. Instead, they were marched east, first to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, and then south to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. The land was hot, swampy, and unfamiliar. Diseases The Nez Perce had no resistance to sweep through them. Children died first, then elders, then the strong. In the years that followed, Joseph spent much of his life as a kind of diplomat for the dead. He traveled to Washington. He met President Hayes. He met President McKinley. He met Theodore Roosevelt. He spoke quietly and respectfully to men whose government had broken every meaningful promise made to him. He asked again and again only one thing: to be allowed to take his people home, to the Wallowa Valley. The answer was always the same: no. In 1885, after years of pressure, the surviving Nez Perce of his band were finally moved north, but not to the Wallowa. Some were sent to the Idaho Reservation. Joseph and the rest were settled at Colville, a reservation in north-central Washington. It was a kinder place than Oklahoma, but it was not home. He lived out the rest of his life there. He continued to ask for the Wallowa. The years passed. His hair turned white. He became a familiar figure to journalists and dignitaries, a living symbol of an era many Americans were already turning into nostalgia. But he was not a symbol. He was a man who had lost almost everything and who carried that loss with great patience. He died in September of 1904 by his own fire at Colville. His doctor reportedly said that he died in the end of a broken heart. He was buried near a small lake on the reservation. He never returned to the valley where he was born. His surrender speech, those few brief words spoken in a snowy meadow in 1811, became one of the most remembered pieces of oratory in American history. Not because it was elegant in a literary sense, not because it argued anything, but because it held in a few honest sentences the entire weight of what was being lost. The chiefs who were dead, the children freezing in the hills, the world that was ending. The decision made in cold light to mark that ending with one's own voice. Sometimes a speech becomes great not because of what the speaker put into it, but because of everything that had been taken away before it. Joseph's words carry that emptiness. They are powerful precisely because they do not try to be more than they are. Lincoln had said much in his short minutes by trusting the silence around his words. Joseph said even less. He let a single sentence end an era. From where the sun now stands, and now, gently, we leave the meadow in Montana and the long flight that ended there. Joseph spoke at the end of a fight he could not win. The army was already on the field, the chiefs already dead, the families already broken by snow and hunger. His words marked an ending, a finality accepted, even chosen in cold light. The next voice we will visit chose differently. He stood not in a meadow at the close of a long flight, but in a wood-paneled courtroom on a different continent, with the power of a hostile state arrayed against him. He was not surrendering. He was speaking into the certainty of a long imprisonment, perhaps a death sentence, and trying to leave behind something that would outlast both. He spoke for nearly 3 hours, and then he sat down and waited to learn whether he would live. The year was 1964. The country was South Africa. The man's name was Nelson Mandela. Where Joseph's speech was a single sentence carrying the weight of a world that had already been lost, Mandela's was a long, careful, almost methodical statement aimed at a world that did not yet exist. He was not speaking for the present. The present in that courtroom was already against him. He was speaking for a future he might never see. He was placing his words into time itself, the way one might bury a letter in a wall, hoping that someone generations later would find it and understand. This, too, is a kind of brevity, though it does not look like it at first. 3 hours is not short. But Mandela's speech is brief in a deeper sense. It is brief in claim. It does not try to argue everything. It does not try to win the trial. It does not even try to save his life. It tries to do only one thing, to name plainly and exactly what the struggle was for and what kind of country he hoped one day to see. To understand why he stood in that courtroom and why his words still travel, we have to step gently into the world he was speaking from, a world arranged by law into the bodies that were allowed to enter certain rooms and the bodies that were not, a world in which his very presence in a public courtroom was already an act of defiance. So, let the snow of Montana drift behind us now. Let the meadow grow quiet. We are crossing the wide ocean and a wide century. We are arriving in a country shaped like a great wedge at the bottom of Africa, where mountains meet the sea, where vineyards and cities and townships sit beside one another in uneasy nearness, and where, for many decades, the answer to almost every question about a person's life began with the color of their skin. The story we are about to enter is not a comfortable one, but it is one of the great stories of the 20th century, and the words at its center were spoken by a man who had decided, before he ever opened his mouth, that he would speak the truth and accept what came of it. His name was Nelson. The country was waiting. South Africa, in the middle of the 20th century, was a country built on a painful idea. The idea was that human beings could be sorted by birth into separate categories, and that those categories could be enforced in nearly every detail of daily life, where a person could live, where they could work, whom they could marry, what benches they could sit on, what schools their children could attend. The system was called apartheid, an Afrikaans word that means apartness. Apartheid did not begin all at once. South Africa had long carried the legacies of colonization, of land taken and labor exploited. Black, mixed race, and Indian South Africans had lived for generations under laws that denied them most of the protections white South Africans enjoyed. But in 1948, a new government came to power that decided to formalize, to harden, and to extend that separation into something more deliberate and more total. In the years that followed, a long series of laws redrew the country. The Population Registration Act required every citizen to be classified by race. The Group Areas Act assigned different races to different urban zones, and forcibly removed those who lived in the wrong place. The Bantu Education Act narrowed the schooling available to black children. Passed laws required black South Africans to carry identification at all times and to produce it whenever asked, on penalty of arrest. To live under such laws was to be reminded daily that one's full humanity was not recognized by the state. A grandmother could be moved out of her home of 40 years because the neighborhood had been reclassified. A child could be denied a school because of how she had been registered at birth. A young man could be stopped on the street, asked for his pass, and jailed for forgetting it. There was also, alongside this, a world of ordinary life, marriages and births, weekends and music, soccer matches and church services, tea on stoops in the warm evenings. People did not stop being people because the laws had become cruel. Resistance to apartheid was not new. The African National Congress, the ANC, had been founded in 1912, long before apartheid acquired its official name. For decades, its leaders had tried to oppose racial laws by petition, by letter, by peaceful protest, by appeals to international bodies. They marched, they wrote, they spoke. The government answered with arrests, bans, and rising violence. In 1960, in the township of Sharpeville, police opened fire on a peaceful crowd protesting the passed laws. 69 people were killed, many shot in the back as they tried to flee. The world was shocked. Within weeks, the ANC was banned. Its leaders were forced underground, and the long question, whether peaceful resistance alone could end apartheid, became impossible to avoid. It was into that question that a young lawyer named Nelson Mandela had stepped. Mandela had been born in the rural Transkei in 1918, into a family with traditional standing among his people. He was sent to mission schools, then to university, and finally to Johannesburg, where he trained as a lawyer. He and his colleague, Oliver Tambo, opened the first black law practice in the country, in a small office where clients lined up out into the street. For years, Mandela had been one of the public faces of nonviolent resistance. He believed, like many of his colleagues, that peaceful protest, sustained over time, could shame and pressure even a hostile government into change. Sharpeville eroded that hope. After the ANC was banned, Mandela and a small group of leaders made one of the most difficult decisions of their lives. They concluded that a strictly nonviolent approach was no longer enough. In 1961, they founded a small armed wing called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of the Nation. Its first acts were carefully limited. They were aimed at infrastructure, at power lines and government buildings, with strict orders to avoid loss of life. The hope was to demonstrate that the system could be made unworkable without becoming a war against ordinary people. Mandela went underground. He grew a beard. He moved between safe houses. For a time, he traveled abroad, training briefly in Algeria and Ethiopia. The press began to call him the Black Pimpernel, a teasing nickname for a man the police could not seem to catch. Then, in August of 1962, returning from a meeting near Durban, he was stopped at a roadblock. Some accounts say a foreign intelligence service had tipped off the police. Others suggest a more local betrayal. Either way, the long evasion ended. He was tried, convicted of inciting workers to strike and of leaving the country without a passport, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. It might have ended there, but while he was serving that sentence, the police raided a farm in Rivonia, north of Johannesburg, and discovered documents linking Mandela and other ANC leaders directly to Umkhonto we Sizwe. A new trial was opened. The charge this time was sabotage, which under South African law could carry the death penalty. 11 men, including Mandela, stood accused. The eyes of the world turned slowly toward a courtroom in Pretoria. Mandela faced a choice any defendant in such a position must face. He could plead, he could deny, he could try to minimize his role and hope for leniency, or he could do something else. He could refuse to defend himself in the ordinary sense and instead use the moment to speak past the judges, past the prosecution, past the apartheid government itself, to a wider audience that did not yet know it was listening. He chose the second path. He would make an opening statement from the dock rather than testify under cross-examination. He would not be questioned. He would rise and speak, and let his words stand as the heart of the defense. On the morning of April 20th, 1964, in the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, Mandela rose in the dock and began to read. He had worked on the speech with his colleagues, drawing on his own life, the history of the ANC, and a careful argument about why a movement of patient men had finally taken up arms. He spoke for nearly 3 hours. The courtroom was full. His mother sat in the gallery. Reporters from around the world filled the press benches. He spoke first about himself, about growing up in a rural homestead, listening to elders tell stories of how the country had once been before colonial conquest, about becoming a lawyer, and about the daily indignities lawyers of his color encountered in courts, where they were officially professionals, but unofficially second-class men. He spoke about the founding of Umkhonto we Sizwe. He explained, with the calm of someone who has nothing left to hide, that he had chosen sabotage carefully, with strict instructions to avoid loss of life, because nothing else had worked. He did not deny the charges. He explained them. He addressed the suggestion that the ANC was simply a front for foreign communism. He spoke about why some of its members had accepted help from the Communist Party in a country where almost no one else would help, but insisted that the ANC's vision was its own, rooted in African history and African aspirations. He spoke of the dignity of work, of the desire of black South Africans to live as full citizens, to walk the streets without a pass, to send their children to schools that prepared them for a real future, to love and marry whom they wished, to vote. And then, near the very end, after nearly 3 hours of careful, patient explanation, he set aside the prepared text. He looked up from his pages, and he spoke directly to the judge. He said that during his lifetime, he had dedicated himself to the struggle of the African people, that he had fought against white domination and against black domination, that he had cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons would live together in harmony, with equal opportunities. He said it was an ideal he hoped to live for and to achieve. And then, looking the judge in the eye, he added the words that would echo for the rest of the century. If need be, it was an ideal for which he was prepared to die. The courtroom was silent. The judge, a man named quietest, did not speak immediately. He gathered his papers. The proceedings continued in their measured way. The verdict and sentencing came in June. Mandela and 7 of his co-accused were convicted. The expected sentence was death. It did not come, whether because of international pressure or unease within the South African legal community, or some calculation we will never know. The judge sentenced them to life imprisonment instead. Mandela was 45 years old. He would serve 27 years. 27 years is a long time, long enough for children to be born and grow up, long enough for a country to harden and slowly, slowly to soften again, long enough for the man who had spoken in that courtroom to become, in the eyes of the world, a kind of patient absence, a name on lists of political prisoners, a face on banners at protests in distant cities. A myth, almost, while the man himself broke rocks in a quarry on Robben Island and watched the years pass. He was finally released in February of 1990. He was 71 years old. The country he walked back into was not yet free, but its long unfreezing had begun. 4 years after that, in 1994, in the first election, in which all South Africans of all colors could vote, he was elected president of the country that had once tried to put him to death. The ideal he had spoken of from the dock, the democratic and free society for which he had been prepared to die, had finally become possible to live for after all. His Rivonia speech is now considered one of the great political speeches of the 20th century. It is taught in classrooms. It is studied by lawyers, by activists, by historians. But its real power, the deeper reason it still travels, is harder to teach. It lies in the fact that he meant every word and proved it by waiting. He waited in a small cell on a windswept island. He waited through the deaths of friends, the birthdays of children he could not hold, the slow erosion of his own youth. He waited while world leaders argued about whether to support him. He waited while the country he loved nearly tore itself apart. And when he finally walked out of prison, he did not retreat into bitterness. He kept the same patience, in the same direction, until the ideal he had named was no longer only a hope. Lincoln had trusted the silence around his words. Joseph had compressed an ending into a single sentence. Mandela trusted time. He spoke for 3 hours and then waited for almost 3 decades, and the words held. Now, gently, our journey shifts again. The next voice we will visit will surprise us. We will leave Pretoria and the long shadow of apartheid and the courtrooms and prisons that shaped a continent. We will arrive somewhere much smaller and much quieter. A committee room in Washington. A hot afternoon in May of 1969. A senator who has been in a cutting mood all day looking at his watch, and a slim, slightly nervous man in a cardigan who has been given 6 minutes to speak about something most people in the room consider unimportant. He will not speak about freedom or empire. He will not face execution or imprisonment. He will speak plainly about how children feel, and the room, against its own expectations, will go very quiet. Fred Rogers was an unlikely figure to find at the center of a political fight. He was a soft-spoken Presbyterian minister who had wandered into children's television almost by accident after watching the early days of the medium with quiet alarm. Most of what he saw on television aimed at children in the late 1950s and early 1960s struck him as loud, frantic, and faintly cruel. Pies and faces, people falling over, adults shouting at one another for laughs. He believed children deserved something gentler, so he set out to make it. By 1969, his program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, had been on public television for 2 years. He spoke directly into the camera as though to one child at a time. He took off his outdoor coat and put on a cardigan. He changed his shoes for sneakers. He sang quiet songs about feelings, about anger, about being scared, about sad days. He visited factories and museums in slow, calm segments. He used puppets to talk about the things children worried about, but rarely had words for. The show looked nothing like the rest of television. Some critics found it dull. Others, watching with their children, found themselves quietly grateful. But public television itself was new and fragile. It was funded partly by the federal government, and that funding was now under threat. President Nixon, hoping to redirect federal money toward other priorities, had proposed cutting the budget for public broadcasting in half, from $20 million to $10. The proposal had to go before a Senate subcommittee where its fate would be decided. The chairman of that subcommittee was Senator John Pastore, a Democrat from Rhode Island. Pastore was not a cruel man, but he was a no-nonsense one. He was famously skeptical of what he considered soft pleas for funding. He had been listening to testimony for hours by the time Fred Rogers' name appeared on the schedule. The room was warm. The papers were stacked. Pastore wanted things to move along. When Rogers entered the room, he carried no slick presentation. He had no film clips to show. He had a folder with a few pages of typed notes. He was slim, slightly nervous, and dressed in a quiet suit. He sat down at the witness table and waited for his turn. Pastore looked at him with mild impatience. He had agreed to give Rogers 6 minutes. He gestured for him to begin. What happened next has been preserved on film. The exchange has been viewed many millions of times since. But on that May afternoon in 1969, no one in the room knew they were about to witness anything memorable. They expected a routine appeal for federal money on behalf of a children's show that, frankly, most of the senators had never seen. Rogers began to speak. His voice was soft, almost too soft for a Senate hearing room. The microphone strained slightly to catch him. He did not begin with statistics. He did not begin with the structure of public broadcasting, or the merits of educational programming, or the threat of cutting half the budget. He began somewhere quieter. He thanked the senator. He said he wanted to share what his program tried to do. He spoke about feelings. He said that children grow up with feelings they do not yet have words for. Anger, sadness, fear, frustration. He said his program tried to give those feelings names and to help children understand that the feelings themselves were not bad. That a child who could name a feeling and learn that others felt it too was a child a little less alone. Pastore, who had been ready to keep things moving, did not interrupt. He listened. Rogers explained that the show did not try to entertain children with constant motion or noise. It tried, instead, to slow down with them, to meet them at their own pace. He talked about the difference between, on the one hand, programming that bombarded young minds with stimulation, and on the other, programming that respected their inner lives. Then he did something unusual. He began to recite from memory the lyrics to a song he had written for the program. The song was about anger, about what to do when you feel like punching something or yelling at someone, about finding ways to manage strong feelings without hurting others or yourself. He recited the words slowly, plainly, as if he were singing them to a single child sitting across from him. The hearing room, which had been busy with shuffled papers and quiet side conversations, grew very still. When he finished, there was a pause. Pastore, who had spent the day being skeptical, looked at the man across from him. The senator was visibly moved. He said quietly that he had goosebumps. And then, almost without thinking, he added the line that has been remembered ever since. "I think it's wonderful," he said. "Looks like you just earned the $20 million. The funding was saved. What had happened? Rogers had not argued. He had not negotiated. He had not flattered the senator or appealed to his sense of duty. He had simply described with absolute sincerity what his work was for. He had spoken in a voice that did not raise itself. He had treated a tired, skeptical politician the same way he treated a 4-year-old at home in front of the television, as someone worth speaking to gently, as someone whose feelings mattered. The senator, in that moment, was not a senator. He was a person, and Rogers had quietly addressed the person rather than the role. There is a lesson here that returns us to a thread we have been following all night. Rogers did not say more than the moment required. 6 minutes, a few quiet sentences, a song he could have skipped. He trusted the smallness of his words to carry their weight. And in that committee room, in the hot, late afternoon, the smallness was enough. We have moved tonight from a battlefield to a meadow, from a meadow to a courtroom, from a courtroom to a small hearing room with a tired senator and a man in a quiet suit. Each setting has grown smaller and more intimate. Each speech has whispered in its own way the same secret, that power and meaning do not belong to volume. Now, for our final stop. The journey reverses itself. We will leave the rooms of human affairs entirely. We will rise above the buildings, above the cities, above the weather, above the atmosphere itself. We will travel outward, past the moon, past the inner planets, past Mars and the asteroid belt, past Jupiter, past Saturn, until we are very far away from anything that has ever held a microphone or argued in a parliament or sentenced a man to prison. We will arrive at the edge of the solar system, where a small spacecraft built by human hands is sailing into the dark. The spacecraft is called Voyager 1. It was launched in 1977, the same year that Chief Joseph's surrender meadow lay quiet under summer grass, nearly a century after the fact. Voyager carried instruments to study the outer planets and a small gold-plated record bearing greetings from Earth and a camera. For more than a decade, it sent back astonishing images. It photographed Jupiter's storms. It revealed the rings and moons of Saturn. It became, by the late 1980s, the most distant human-made object in the universe. In 1990, as Voyager continued its long outward drift, an astronomer named Carl Sagan made an unusual request. He suggested that the spacecraft, before its camera was shut down to save power, be turned around, not toward another planet, not toward a star, but back across the immense distance it had traveled, back toward the small blue world from which it had begun. The engineers were initially uncertain. The maneuver would offer almost no scientific value. The Earth would appear in any such photograph not as a planet, but as a speck, a grain, less than a pixel. That, Sagan said, was precisely the point. The command was sent. Voyager turned. Its camera looked back across 3.7 billion miles of empty space. And then, on Valentine's Day in 1990, it took the picture. The image, when it returned to Earth, showed mostly blackness. Streaks of scattered sunlight ran across the frame, artifacts of the camera looking too close to the sun, and inside one of those bright bands, almost invisible at first, was a single tiny dot, a pale blue point of light. That was home. That was every continent and ocean. That was every city, every village, every farm. That was every human being who had ever lived, every emperor and every slave, every battlefield, every cradle, every cathedral, every act of cruelty, and every act of kindness. All of it contained in a fraction of a single pixel of light. Sagan looked at the image, and then, in his soft and patient voice, he began to speak. Sagan's reflection on the pale blue dot was not delivered as a speech in the ordinary sense. It was written. He spoke it later, in his own voice, as narration. There was no podium, no audience clapping, no microphone in the Senate chamber. There was only the photograph and his patient writer's voice drawing the listener gently toward something difficult to feel any other way. He invited his readers to look again at that small dot. He said that everyone they had ever loved, everyone they had ever heard of, every human being who had ever existed, had lived out their lives there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. He spoke of all the rivers of blood that had been spilled by generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. He spoke of the misunderstandings between groups of people who, on this tiny stage, were so close to one another and yet treated each other as if they were enemies in some vast separate world. He spoke of how often human beings had forgotten how small the stage really was. And then, in the same gentle voice, he turned the lens the other way. He said the image also showed something else. It showed how rare and precious that pale blue dot is, because so far as anyone has been able to discover, it is the only home any of us has ever known. There is no evidence yet, he said, that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. It was not a despairing speech. It was not, in the end, even sad. It was simply true, and true in a way that could only be felt from very far away. Sagan understood that distance can be a teacher. From up close, every quarrel feels enormous. Every grievance is real. Every loss is the size of one's own life, which is the only life one has. But from far away, the same quarrels and griefs become impossibly small, not unimportant, just small, held inside something larger and more patient. To stand on the pale blue dot is to feel one's own life as urgent and meaningful. To see the pale blue dot from 3.7 billion miles is to feel something different. A tenderness, a protectiveness, a recognition that all of us are passengers on the same fragile vessel, traveling together through an enormous quietness, and that whatever differences seem to divide us are not nearly as deep as the simple fact of sharing a single fragile world. Lincoln had spoken over a battlefield, asking what the dead had given the living. Joseph had spoken in a snowy meadow, marking the end of a way of life. Mandela had spoken in a courtroom, naming an ideal he was prepared to die for. Rogers had spoken in a hearing room, describing how children feel. Sagan, alone among them, did not need a room at all. His speech was delivered to the universe itself, on behalf of every person who had ever lived on a small blue speck of light. And the speck listened, and so, gently, our journey is ending. We began with a thought that most words pass without record, that most voices vanish into the air that carried them, but that now and then a voice finds the right silence, and what it says there lasts. We have visited 5 such voices tonight. They could not have been more different from one another. A president, a chief, a prisoner, a children's host, an astronomer, a cemetery, a meadow, a courtroom, a hearing room, a photograph from the edge of the solar system. And yet, as we looked at them more closely, the same quiet truth came forward again and again. Power and meaning do not belong to volume. Speeches are not great because they are loud or long. They are great because they arrive at the right moment and trust the silence around them and refuse to fill more space than they need. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes, and let the graves do the rest. Joseph spoke a single sentence and ended an era. Mandela spoke for 3 hours and then let 27 years finish his argument. Rogers spoke for 6 minutes and changed a senator's mind by treating him like a child who deserved to be heard. Sagan spoke into the empty distance, reminding us that all our voices belong to a single pale blue point of light. Each of these voices was, in its own way, an act of trust. Trust that words spoken honestly in the right place would be carried. Trust that listeners somewhere, sometime, would hear them. None of these speakers could be sure of that when they spoke. Lincoln thought his speech had failed. Joseph spoke knowing his world was ending. Mandela spoke believing he might be sentenced to death. Rogers spoke into the impatience of a tired senator. Sagan spoke to a universe that, so far as anyone knows, had no listeners at all. And yet the words held. They are still holding now, traveling quietly through us on a small blue planet, late on an ordinary evening. Outside the room, the world continues. Cities turn their slow lights on and off. Snow falls somewhere, and somewhere else the warm rain begins. Voices speak and are forgotten, and a few will be remembered. We do not know which ones. The speakers themselves rarely know. They simply do their honest work and trust the silence to carry it. Tonight, perhaps, that is the gift to keep. Not the names, not the dates, not the perfect sequence of every speech we have visited. Only the mood of it, the sense that even small voices, spoken truly, can travel further than they imagine. Let the cemetery rest. Let the meadow rest. Let the courtroom rest. Let the hearing room rest. Let the spacecraft drift on into the long dark, with its faint message still in its hold. The world is full of noise, but somewhere, always, a voice is finding the right silence and quietly saying something that will last. The room is dim, the day is done, the voices have spoken, and now they rest. And so, gently, do we. Good night.